Hello. Thank you for joining us today for the Community Development Exchange. The Community Development Exchange is a webinar series offered by University of Minnesota Extension through our Department of Community Development. My name is Brigid Tuck. I am the Applied Research Specialist with the University of Minnesota Extension, and I'll be one of the prime speakers at the webinar series on this particular webinar. We did have a little bit of a recording issue with the live webinar, so I have re-recorded the first little bit because we missed recording that. So you might see a little bit of change in the format here as we put together those first couple of slides with the remainder of the presentation. In this presentation, closed captioning is available, so feel free if you need to use that feature for your listening pleasure today. I'm going to talk a little bit about what's happening in the economy today. As I mentioned, I'm the applied research specialist. My job is to really work with communities across the state of Minnesota, helping them understand what's going on with their economy. As part of that work, oftentimes I talk to communities about their structure and their economy, and so I'm building on that today. My primary job is to run our economic impact analysis program. After I talk about the economy for a little bit, I will invite in my colleague, Ben Winchester. Ben is a rural sociologist and evaluation specialist with University of Minnesota Extension. He conducts applied research on economic, social, and demographic data topics surrounding the theme of rewriting the rural narrative. So many of you have probably seen or heard Ben present before. So with that, I'm going to talk a little bit about what's happening in Minnesota's economy. I come at the economy really from a regional economist approach. What that means is I really think about the economy from sort of that local perspective and understanding what's happening at the community level. And I think it's really important to understand the fundamentals of the economy before we start thinking about how things that are happening at a larger scale might be impacting the economy. And so that is really the focus today, is really to talk about what are the fundamentals of Minnesota's economy and how has that been changing with time. So with that, I invite people as we go through this presentation to just sort of think about this in your own head. But what do you think are the most important issues facing Minnesota's economy today? I ask this question a lot when I'm out in presentations, and I love to hear what people are thinking about at the community level. So I invite you to consider this question as we move through the presentation. So I'm going to start today by talking a little bit about what's happening in Minnesota's economy, and then I'll shift and talk a little bit about some of the national trends and how those are influencing Minnesota's economy. So first, if we just generally look at trends in employment, overall employment in the state of Minnesota is higher in 2025 than it was prior to the pandemic. So this chart starts in 2001, goes through 2025. You can see here that each bar represents the number of jobs in a particular year. The axis isn't zero, so we see the changes more magnified than they would be if we looked at that in terms of zero. But you can see in 2001, we start with just shy of 3 million jobs, 2.95 million jobs in the state of Minnesota. We see growth in the 2000s. Then in around 2009, 2010, we see the impact of the Great Recession. And so Minnesota drops back to about 2.91 million jobs. But then we see this nice long sustained growth from 2010 to 2019. So we continue to see just kind of nice, slow year over year growth in the number of jobs. We peak at about 3.22 million jobs in 2019. Of course, then we have the impact of COVID, and you can see the drop there in 2020. And then again, coming out of COVID, we've seen stable growth, maybe a little bit of a leveling off in 2025. But again, just kind of that nice growth. Now, if we'd stayed on the growth trajectory we were on before COVID, we would certainly be at a higher level of jobs in Minnesota. But this gives us a sense that we have been adding jobs at the state level. But the kind of breakout and how this has been playing out in different regions of the state does look different depending on where you are. So for ease of this presentation today, I have looked at this from the Initiative Foundation regions. So if you're not familiar, Northland is what maybe some of us would call the Arrowhead, so kind of the Duluth area. And then the Southern Minnesota Initiative Foundation covers large parts of southern Minnesota, including the Mankato and Rochester areas. So if we start out by looking what happened between 2019 to 2020, so sort of as we see the impacts of COVID playing out, we can see that all of the regions in the state of Minnesota have a percent decline in the number of jobs. The Northland and the Twin Cities have kind of maybe the highest percentage of jobs, but this is, kind of an experience that happens to all communities or all parts of the state. So then if we look what happens in 2019 or 2020 to 2021, so kind of coming out of that COVID period, you can see central Minnesota is first to kind of start adding jobs, and you'll see southwest Minnesota does start adding jobs, but maybe not quite as quickly as some of the other regions. When we get to 2021, 2022, again, all of the regions are growing, some at a faster pace than others. The Twin Cities starts to pick up the pace a little bit and start adding jobs at a greater level. But again, Southwest, not quite as fast as many of the other regions. And then if we throw the 3-year period from 2022 to 2025, again, we see growth for most regions. Southwest actually sees a little bit of a decline during that time period. But overall, you can see that Southwest Minnesota continues to sort of struggle to really see the same growth rates as the rest of the state. And that could be a variety of factors. It could be kind of a workforce thing. There may not be people to fill jobs that may be open. It could be that there are just not as many jobs available in the region. There are a lot of factors at play there, but you can see that the impacts of COVID and sort of the recovery have not been even across Minnesota. And another thing that we've seen sort of play out as well, this chart comes courtesy of my friends at the Met Council and Greater MSP, but just looking at how did the Twin Cities perform compared to other metro economies across the United States. So what this is doing is looking at 2019 as sort of the base year, and then looking at do we have more jobs in 2019 or fewer jobs in 2019 by region? And this line here, yellow, is 100%. So if you're above the line, you have more jobs than you did in 2019. If you're below the line, you have fewer jobs. It's very messy. I understand that. But there are only, if you look here kind of at 2025, March of 2025, there are only a few regions that are still below where they were in 2019. And the Twin Cities region is one of those. And of course, the Twin Cities is kind of one of our driving economies. Obviously Minnesota, the Twin Cities, and Greater Minnesota go hand in hand together in a lot of ways. And so that is something to kind of have on our radar. This chart comes to us from our friends, my friends at the Met Council and Greater MSP. If we look at the Twin Cities, sort of, it's an economic driver for the state. If we look at that and we compare it to what's been happening in other large metros across the US, we find that the Twin Cities hasn't really grown as quickly as or recovered as quickly as some of the regions. So this is a really messy chart, but basically this 100% here, that shows kind of where indexed to where we were in 2019. So if we look at what employment looked like in 2019, everybody above that line is showing growth. Regions below the line are regions that haven't necessarily kind of gotten back to that 2019 level or above. And the Twin Cities is one of 3 regions that really hasn't gotten back to that pre-2019 employment level. So while we are seeing growth in the state of Minnesota and we are seeing recovery, the Twin Cities maybe is lagging behind some of the other larger metros across the United States. When I look at the economy and I kind of look at this fundamentals question, one of the things I like to look at is what are our drivers? What are our current employers? What are our major employers at this time? So this just shows the total number of jobs by industry across Minnesota. I don't have agriculture in here, but you can see professional and business services is the largest share of jobs is in that particular sector. This is a large sector. I've grouped a lot of things in here. It includes everything from architects and engineers to insurance agents to waste remediation to administrative and support services. So there's a lot of things in there, but it is our largest employer. We see healthcare and social assistance up there, as well as trade. trade here includes both retail trade and wholesale trade. But one of the things you can really tell about Minnesota's economy in a lot of ways is that we're very balanced. So we have a good mix of industries. We're not particularly concentrated in one industry or another, and that oftentimes allows us to weather economic downturns. You know, you may have one industry that's struggling, but others come up. If you think about some of our neighbors, you know, like North Dakota, sometimes what's happening with the oil industry can have some real impacts back on the state. So we do have kind of that nice balance to help us weather changes in the economy in general. I also really love this slide. This comes from our friends at the Center for Rural Policy and Development. If you haven't seen it, they do a State of Rural report every year. It's fantastic. But I think this also just shows the strength of Minnesota kind of by county here. So what it's showing is the top employing industry by county. Their categories are a little different than mine, but that dark orange is education and healthcare. So if you think a lot about Minnesota, I think we would say a lot of our communities, our top employers are the school district and the healthcare systems, right? And so that shows up. But sort of the medium orange there is our farm employment. So we have a lot of counties, especially in western Minnesota, where farm employment continues to be a really important piece of the economy. We have leisure and hospitality. So Cook County and Lake of the Woods County really showing up as having that leisure and hospitality base, that tourism base. The light blue here is manufacturing. So we do have a number of counties that are really strong manufacturing based, particularly kind of around the Twin Cities in that corridor, but also counties up in northern Minnesota as well. And then the dark blue is trade, transportation, and warehousing. So again, although there are some similarities, we do have some differences, and that does help us have a more resilient economy. I think a lot also sort of gets made about the difference between greater Minnesota and the Twin Cities, and we talk a lot about these differences that we have. But really, when we look at our job kind of breakout by industry, we look a lot more alike than we really do different. So here the red is the Twin Cities and kind of the gold color is greater Minnesota. And it just shows the distribution of jobs by industry. And you can see that in general, the trends are the same, right? Like the ratios are pretty close to the same. The big difference is professional and business services. The Twin Cities has a higher concentration there than greater Minnesota does. But again, a lot of times when we look at what our industry composition is and how our economies are functioning, we really do look more alike than we do different across the state. I also like to look at the economic drivers in terms of the growing industries. So these are industries that have been adding jobs. Perhaps they haven't been on our top couple of job numbers in the recent years, but they might be in the future, right? So if we look at the number of jobs by industry from 2010, so the end of the Great Recession, through 2025, we've really seen a lot of growth in the healthcare and social assistance sector. So this was a question that someone asked me the other day, like, oh, they had heard like coming out of COVID that healthcare was really the driver of our job recovery, and we can see it in the data here that healthcare has been a really important part of Minnesota's growth. We've seen growth in professional and business services. We see growth in construction and growth in that leisure and hospitality related sector. So generally speaking, we've seen growth across all of our industries in Minnesota, but definitely that strength in that healthcare sector. That also
Brigid,
does, yeah,
can I just
sorry.
real quickly,
Yep.
David is asking about agriculture. So he was asking in an earlier
Oh,
slide,
yep.
and he's curious if agriculture is left out of the last slide that you had.
Yes, agriculture is generally not in the data that I have here today. The reason for that is agriculture, um, when they publish data for agriculture in the sort of deed, Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development, their agriculture data is really more focused on the number of people who are working on farms and not necessarily doesn't necessarily include the actual farmers. So I'm always a little hesitant to put it in there because it doesn't include that. But it is an important part of our economy for sure. So if we also look at, you know, how our changes have occurred over time, so we have the change in jobs here by industry. Now, The Twin Cities has more jobs than Greater Minnesota in general. So these bars are not percentages, these are total changes. But you can definitely see, again, that a lot of our growth is coming in the same places. Greater Minnesota did see a little bit of a decline in the number of professional business service jobs while the Twin Cities grew. But really, you can see that healthcare and social assistance, particularly in the Twin Cities region, has grown substantially from 2010 to 2025. Overall, the number of jobs in the Twin Cities is up about 14%, whereas the number of jobs in Greater Minnesota is up about 8%. So again, growth, but a little bit higher growth rates in the Twin Cities. And then the last way I like to look at economic drivers is from a concentration perspective. So this basically takes the percentage jobs in a particular industry in the state and compares it to the national average. So if our number is above one, that means we have a higher concentration of jobs in a particular industry compared to the national average. So now here we see manufacturing really pop out, right? Manufacturing wasn't necessarily, in our top three or four in terms of employment, but in terms of this industry concentration and kind of being a sort of thing that we're good at, manufacturing definitely pops out over one. Healthcare and social assistance is also up there, as well as utilities and trade. Those are all over one. When you're over concentrated in one thing, that means you're under concentrated in other things, and you can see kind of where that breaks out. And even professional business services, which was our kind of number one in terms of total employment, that still stays below one. So even though we have a strength there, we don't have as many jobs kind of compared to the national average in that particular sector. So these are always, to me, when I'm talking to communities, that's always like an area of potential opportunity, to talk about why don't we have more jobs in that particular area. I always love to talk about manufacturing too, because I feel like one of the fun things or cool, unique things about Minnesota is that we do really have a mix of manufacturing as well. We're not particularly concentrated in one type of manufacturing. So again, this shows industries with a location quotient of more than 1.2. So these are sectors of manufacturing that we have a little bit of a concentration. And again, you can see that these are very different. We've got printing, we've got leather, we've got wood, we've got food, we've got non-metallic mineral. These are all very different. Again, that is good from an economic perspective when you're weathering economic downturn. It can sometimes be more difficult if you're trying to share skills, right? The skills may not transfer as easily between your manufacturing sectors, but it is oftentimes a strength. The other thing I always like to look at is kind of what is our average employment. So if you take the total number of employment in manufacturing in Minnesota and divide it by the number of companies that do it, the average is like 38. Average size is 38 employees. So I think in our minds, we often have this concept of manufacturing being these large, facilities with hundreds of employees, and that is certainly true. We do have those in Minnesota. But I think you would be surprised if you looked around your communities, how many sort of smaller facilities, maybe 5 to 10 employees, 10 to 20 employees that are doing a lot of really important, kind of interesting manufacturing jobs that we don't necessarily think of when we think about manufacturing. This slide is also one of my favorites to show in community, looking at retail trade. So this is per capita taxable sales for retail and services. So it's all the sales in a county for retail and sales related, and then divided by the number of people. And so oftentimes I like to say, especially when I'm in Wilmer, I'll ask, what do you think of the retail sector in Wilmer? And they'll all say, oh, it's not that great. And then I'll say, well, isn't it amazing that you're in the top 10 counties for retail sales? Because I think people don't always think about kind of where they fit into the bigger picture. But two things always pop out to me when I look at the retail trade sort of economy in Minnesota. One is if you look at this chart, I mean, you've got Cook County over here at the high end. Cook County, of course, is a tourism destination for us, outdoor recreation, all sorts of great things going on in Cook County. And so they're attracting more people in and they're generating more sales per capita than any other county. And you can sort of see that tourism and outdoor recreation influence in here. So you see like Crow Wing with Brainerd and Baxter. You can see Douglas with Alexandria. And then you also see the kind of regional centers play out here, right? You see Blue Earth and Mankato and Bemidji and Beltrami. And so I think it just makes us kind of maybe reframe how we think a little bit about retail and service in our communities. Definitely those tourism and then those regional centers are really benefiting from that. Then, the other thing to kind of think about, or I think about, is thinking about how our workforce dynamics are playing out in the state. So this just shows the change in the number of people by age bracket in Minnesota between 2010 and 2025. So when I show this in communities, the first thing that sort of jumps out is that we're gaining people in sort of that over the age of 60 category, right? And I would say, where are these people headed in the next, 10 to 15 years? I'm sure they're hoping that they're headed to retirement. So we definitely see kind of people moving out of the labor force. And then if we look at like kind of who's coming up behind them, we just don't have as many people in those age brackets to sort of fill those positions as they are leaving the labor force. And this has been, a constraint in Minnesota. We've been talking about it for a long time, but I always think it's interesting to look at the data. We too have also been losing people in kind of that 25 to 29-year-old category as a state. And I know that's something people in the Twin Cities have been thinking about, is how do we kind of retain that age group as well. And our workforce is just becoming increasingly diverse. So here we've got that kind of same breakout, but we've added white non-Hispanic in the gold, and then the red is the BIPOC community. And you can see, under the age of 60, most of the growth across our state is coming from, diverse populations. And I think we see workforces really, or businesses really coming up with creative ways to embrace that and make our places very friendly to work. So how does this all play out with the labor force then, right? Like, okay, we know we've got these constraints, we know we got these changes. How is that really playing out at the end of the day? So this shows the number of people in the labor force in Minnesota from 2006 to 2025. Again, the axis is not zero, but you can just see people in the labor force include those who are employed and those who are seeking work. So it's both sides of that equation. But you can see we had nice steady labor force growth, maybe not as fast as we wanted it to be for a number of years. We do see a little bit of a slide with the pandemic, and then we see people continuing to come back into the labor force. So despite some of these trends, we are seeing the labor force continue to grow. And so you might say, well, how are we doing that? And the Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development came out with a great article a couple weeks ago, kind of getting into this. And they looked at the change in Minnesota's employment number of people in the age categories between 2020 and 2025. So they look at pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, but this really caught my attention. One of these is surprising to me. One of these was not surprising to me. So if you look at who's coming back into the labor force, definitely are teens. And so that was a surprise to me. I have some data in a minute to show you that maybe explains why teens are coming into the labor force, but they actually increased their labor force participation rates during the pandemic as well. So we are definitely seeing kind of more of that 14 to 18-year-old in our labor force. The other is seniors. I wasn't really surprised to see the seniors that they're increasing, partially because they were one of the big populations that chose to sit out early in the pandemic. They just, for health reasons, and they had the retirement and the income, and they just opted out of the labor force. So it's not surprising for me to see them kind of come back now that they feel, comfortable with health things and maybe thinking a little bit more about finances again. That's not surprising, but the teens was a surprise to me until we started looking a little bit at this. So this shows the number of job openings versus people seeking work in Minnesota. So the gold here is the job vacancies. The red line is the number of people unemployed. So you can see during the Great Recession, we had fewer job vacancies, more people seeking work. Even by 2017, we were starting to get into this tight labor force where we had more job vacancies than we did people seeking work. And then we, have a 1 year little blip there in 2020. But by 2021, we're really knee deep in it. And you could see that even though we still have that kind of labor force shortage, it is easing. The job vacancies are coming down a little bit. The number of people looking for work is coming up a little bit. So it's not as tight as it was in 2021, but it is still an issue across the state. But if you look at the jobs that are open, 36%, so roughly 1 in 3 require secondary education. So 2 out of 3 of these jobs don't require anything beyond high school, which would indicate that maybe our teens could take these jobs. And then about half or so require less than years of experience. So again, these jobs that are kind of open are very targeted, or teens can fill them, and that probably explains it. I get a lot of questions sometimes about, well, if we have such a tight labor market, then why can't so and so, my cousin, my brother, whoever, find a job right now. And I think we just sometimes have a structural mismatch between the jobs that are open and the people that are looking for work. So, I think when we get really tight labor markets, we tend to churn, and the job openings tend to be some of our lower skilled because as soon as they get skilled, people move up in the labor force. And then as a result of all of that, we do see wages are rising, right? You put pressure on the labor market, you're going to see wages go up. This is not adjusted for inflation, but you can see there the Twin Cities generally just has higher wages. There's a lot there about cost of living too, but you can see all the regions have really been increasing. And in the last couple of years, with that increased pressure on the labor force, we've seen wages rise. And you can see it right here if you look at just that Twin Cities between 2008 and 2009, when we sort of were in the recession, the Great Recession, you can see wages actually took a little bit of a dip. So they do react to what's happening in the greater economy. And then, when you think about like, okay, we have jobs, we want people, how do we get them into our communities? It doesn't take you very long to get to housing. So this chart shows active housing listings in the state of Minnesota. I hear a lot from communities about how hard it is to find housing. I love to show them this chart to make them feel like, what, the struggle is real. So you do see the kind of cyclical nature. We don't like to move in January in Minnesota. But if you look back in July of 2016, we had about 25,000 or so active housing listings in Minnesota. If you get to July of 2021, so kind of coming out of the pandemic, we drop off, more than in half, and there's only about 10,000 housing listings. We've recovered here a little bit, where we're getting more housing listings, active ones, but it continues to be below what it was, prior to the pandemic. So the struggle is real if you're looking in housing. So with that, I'm going to turn and talk just a little bit about some of the current economic conditions out there and sort of how we ended up where we ended up. This is one of my favorite equations. If you know what it is, shout it in your head. But it's consumer spending plus government spending plus business investment plus net exports. And this, of course, is GDP. And so when you think about what was happening in our economy coming out of the pandemic, if you're in Washington, D.C. and you're a decision maker and you're like, wow, we don't want to see, a massive decline in the economy. What can we control here? There's really two parts of this equation that you start to look at. One is government spending. Of course, as the government, you control that directly. And so we saw the government do things here, with stimulus packages and extending unemployment benefits to kind of try to keep that government spending piece of this going. But then you also really think about consumer spending. So the consumer spending drives anywhere from 60 to 70% of GDP in any given year. So really like thinking about the consumer and what the consumer wanted to do. Again, that's part of why we did some of those stimulus type packages. But it really has a huge impact on our economy. And what happened with the COVID is we just kind of went on this wild ride of consumer spending. So this shows the percent change in consumer spending by quarter. This is adjusted for inflation, but you can see just like, we're kind of used to growing at, kind of 1 to 2% in any given quarter. All of a sudden along comes COVID, we take this huge dive in one quarter. Consumer spending drops by about 10% in one quarter. So you can imagine businesses were reacting to this. They're like, the consumer's not spending, they're pulling back, we have to pull back. We kind of start to like everyone takes a step behind. And then we come into third quarter. Of course, it's getting into summer where we can be outside more and consumer spending just absolutely surges. It recovers by about 10%. And that really caught a lot of businesses off guard. And they're like, well, how do we react to that? How do we ramp up production now that when we sort of stepped back, and it's all happening in a very short time frame. And then we continue to see consumer spending be at higher rates through kind of 2021. So all of this together with some supply chain disruptions really left us in a very inflationary period for a while there in the United States. This whole sort of change was particularly dramatic for our manufacturers. So if we look at the change in consumer spending by category, so services stayed just about flat. We kind of maintained our spending on services, but we saw dramatic increases in our spending for durable and non-durable goods. So we really saw, if you were making manufacturing things that were going to last more than 3 to 5 years, things like recreational equipment or people wanted to, buy treadmills for their basement and all these kinds of things. They really saw demand for their products spike. We also saw non-durable goods. We were buying masks and hand sanitizers and toilet paper. That also spiked during that time period. And so the manufacturers were really scrambling to kind of meet that demand and ramp up for that. At the same time, they were looking at sort of a tough labor pool. When we look at the change in the labor force participation rate from January of 2020 to October of 2021, we saw that the over 25 without a college education, so the prime sort of market for manufacturers in terms of labor, that actually was shrinking. And so it was harder for them to find the employees if they wanted to ramp up production. So if we kind of turn the corner and we're like, okay, we see where the history was, we see how we got here. Let's look at where we think consumer spending or where the economy is sort of going. We see consumer spending continuing to shift sort of back towards more normal levels. So this is the percent change in consumer spending from 2024 to 2025. So I was trying to look at sort of the last year. You can see spending for services, they're all kind of similar. We've seen increases, but it's a little more evenly distributed. There isn't a huge spike in one particular piece of the economy in any way. So a little bit more stability here. There are some sectors within that are growing faster than others. So if we start to kind of drill down and think, well, who should we be, what communities should be thinking about this if you have manufacturers in certain sectors? We definitely see clothing and footwear expenditures continuing to increase, recreational goods and vehicles also increasing. But then we see less growth in things like food and beverages and furnishings. So again, depending on, you might have manufacturers in these particular industries and sectors in your communities, and that's how that's kind of playing out a little bit. And then the last thing I like to look at is consumer sentiment, right? So this is one metric of how the consumer is thinking. Will consumer spending continue to increase, right? Because that's the question. If it's 60 to 70% of the economy, thinking about what the consumer might do over the next year is pretty important. So this is a consumer sentiment index. It's published by the University of Michigan. I just have again the last year because I kind of want to focus in on like what's been happening. If you look pre-COVID, the index is higher, so it is down just in general since after COVID. But you can see it has been trending down in the last couple of months here. And generally speaking, this index is broken into two kind of pieces. One is like our current feelings about the economy, and one is our future feelings about the economy. So, generally speaking, people's feelings about the economy right now are a little more pessimistic. So, if you say, how do you feel about your personal finances right now? That's been kind of trending downward. If you ask about, would you be willing or able to make a large purchase? That's been trending down a little bit. But then when we ask about, the question is asked about where do you think you're going to be in the future? So what do you think your personal finances will be like, in a couple of months or years? That's ticking up. If you ask about business conditions in a year or business conditions in 5 years, those are also ticking upwards. So generally speaking, the consumer is maybe feeling a little squeezed right now, but still continues to think optimistically for the future, which might mean that they keep spending money if they think future conditions are going to be good. So I'm going to just take a couple minutes. There were a few questions that were submitted in advance, and so I'll just take a quick swing at answering a couple of those, and then I'll hand it over to Ben. So one of the questions which I absolutely loved was the economy is so large. What are the key measures and in what context should we measure or talk about the economy? And I kind of said this at the beginning, but I really think about the economy, it depends on where you're trying to sort of interact with the economy, right? If you're an analyst on Wall Street, you're definitely going to be, watching all of those metrics about the stock market and the bonds and all those kinds of things. But I interact with the economy really at the local level. So I'm really thinking about that consumer. Where is that consumer spending going? Because that's really going to have a huge impact. If consumers start to pull back, our businesses, no matter what size your community is, are going to start to feel that impact. So, kind of where is the consumer going? What do I manufacture, or what sort of services do I have in my community? And is that where the consumer is going to want to continue to spend money? And then also looking at just the fundamentals of the economy in my community. What are our drivers? Where are our weaknesses? What are the things that we can build upon to continue to grow our economy? So I really do think, like when you think about the economy, Think about the consumer, think about what's in your community and how that might play into consumer demand. This is also a great question. Is there a centralized library of community success stories? So there is this great resource available via the University of North Carolina. I have the link here, but I think Brandon, we can probably send this out too. But there is a great repository where they've done a lot of case studies. They're kind of focused on small towns, but small town has different definitions depending on where you are. So some of these would be really big towns in my mind, but that's okay. But you can search those case studies by community size, by issue. Like there's case studies about successful entrepreneurship. There's case studies about transitioning economies. Maybe they have a big manufacturer that has left town and they have to kind of re-envision their community. There's all sorts of different topics in there. There's tourism, outdoor recreation. So great resources at this website. So I encourage you if you're thinking about something in your community, you want to read about how someone else tackled it, please check out this particular site. This one weighs on my mind a lot. So I am on the school board and we are trying to figure out what to do about paid leave, or how is paid leave going to affect the school district. So this question was, how have these new laws affected small businesses in rural Minnesota? I mean, it's obviously way too soon to sort of tell how this is going to play out. I was always jealous in school of the science majors because they had like a little test tube and they could put like a little drop of this and a little drop of that in there and then they could see what happens. With the economy, it's often so hard to tell, right? There's so many factors at play that it's often hard to be able to tease out like how much of a role did this particular policy or that policy have. I do think it's going to have some impacts on workforce. And so how that might play out. It's also arguably going to have some impacts on productivity. If you think about how do we continue to grow if we're not growing our labor force, productivity is an important component of that. So I don't know, there's arguments on both sides of the productivity issue. So I don't know that we know the answer to this one yet. And then another fantastic question, how will young people contribute to the economy? We've already seen that young people are entering the labor force at higher rates, but we also know some of the research that my colleague Neil Lynchide has done around entrepreneurship. I know our friends over in youth development are doing some really exciting things about getting students connected, both to their community and their businesses, but also giving them some skills around entrepreneurship so that they can contribute. So I'm going to stop there and I'm going to hand it over to Ben. Welcome, Ben.
Thanks, Brigid. Yeah, hi everybody. My name is Ben Winchester, a rural sociologist in the same department as Brigid here. And really, it's been my pleasure to work alongside Brigid and to, accommodate economic perspectives in some sociological understandings of the world, I'll say. So really, our economies aren't created in a vacuum here. Really, society helps create and is shaped by some of our economy. And I'm going to share a little bit of a background that we've got here to understand kind of the rural condition, is what we'll call it. What kind of condition are we in our rural communities? So on one side, we do know that economic development wise, we would say that it's not just a one size fits all approach. Steve Deller, our colleague at the University of Wisconsin Extension, does a lot of work around approaches to economic development. And we think about that, why would people want to move to my town, right? If your approach is industrial attraction, right, we bring in a business, and then when that business is here, there's a reason for people to move here. Or sometimes you want to support entrepreneurs. We want to grow our own. People can move here and help establish a business or grow a business. Or other times we're building in cooperation, partnership, and clusters. We have medical industries. We have cheese across Wisconsin. You work in clusters, but more today, we find that we're in the midst of this labor shortage, and it is our inability to recruit people into our communities that inhibits the ability for us to grow our economy. So we do talk about this rural narrative that there's a brain drain, we live in the middle of nowhere, and we kind of cut that off right off here. Well, and I'll just say, if rural is dying, then why can't I find a home to buy? So we'll just start with that and say that we have done research around what we call the rural brain gain. And that since the 1970s, there's been a regular pattern of people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s moving to rural America, not just highly recreational places, but we find that no place is immune to interest of people wanting to live there. And they're choosing to move to these places. And why did they choose? It's number one was simpler pace of life, immediate access to recreation. There's like push and pull factors in this, right? You might have things pushing you away from where you are and things that pull you. Your family lives in a region. You want to move closer. Quality of life. Number two is safety and security. That's especially high with female-headed households and households with children. And the third top reason we've seen for a very long time, up until 7 years ago, has been the low cost of housing. Not in the top 10 anymore, but it was in our top 10 for a very long time. And so when we think about, what are these motivations for why people move to our rural communities? And we think about that industrial attraction model, right? And we ask newcomers, people that moved between 1 and 5 years ago, did you move to this small town because you had a job or a job offer in that community? And our latest studies have been done in 2019 here in Minnesota. Montana, and so that's a year before the pandemic. Montana did their studies 2021, a year into the pandemic, and now South Dakota just last year, into the pandemic, now post-pandemic, many would say. So when we look at this data point, those households that say they move primarily for a job, 4 out of 10, just I would say, 4 out of 10 households are moving because they had a job or a job offer, and that was before the pandemic. But now into the pandemic, that number falls even further down to 35%, where just 1 in 3 households now need a job in that community. And right, this makes sense. The pandemic afforded an opportunity for employees by their employers to live wherever they wanted, and they did. And they chose many places all across the country, remote rural, high recreational rural. We see this. In South Dakota, this continues to fall. Now, think if you're an employer in town, if your economic development strategy is to bring in an employer, but not right now, you got people moving in there and not taking on local jobs. I want you throughout this to think about the tension around your housing stocks. Now, the second line here, a lot of times we think about like, yeah, who's moving to our rural community? Who's going to move to Clontarf unless you grew up there, right? Well, we find that just 1 in 4 newcomer households have previous connections there, had lived there before. What we find the other way is 3 out of 4 newcomer households are not from there. And so our communities, we know, and when we do this kind of polling in our communities, are filled with people not from there. And so we have, since the 1970s, filled our rural communities with people not necessarily from there. Again, the baby boomers, we talk about demographic destiny. Demographics can dictate, whether your labor pool gets bigger or smaller. It's not a result of people being lazy or not wanting to choose a job. It is the inability to just have enough people to fill these jobs in many ways. So lived in the community before, 1 in 4. This has been a long-standing trait. Majority of movers are not from there, but during the pandemic, this went up for the first time. And we wondered why. And then we realized that housing stocks are virtually impossible to come by in rural communities. So these focus groups focused on, like, why did you move in? And so those that reported an access to a housing stock had knowledge of where to move. So it is, who has knowledge of local housing stocks? People who lived in their community before. Like my mom lived in town, she knows when that house is going to open up. So we saw during this pandemic a rise in the percentage of returnees, but that has now fallen back down. So these are some of the dynamics we play in. And again, you might have movers moving in. 21% of newcomer households are telecommuting for a company not in the region. And that was a year before the pandemic. So again, like you've got dynamics around housing. If I move into your small town, but I'm telecommuting for extension, I'm not taking on a local job, right? Got demands over your housing stocks. I love the work Brigid does throughout this because it expresses for me the fact that we have a much more diverse economy in rural America. So rather than saying like, would you ever think about moving to a rural place? And people are like, I just can never find a job there. Like we've shown pretty clearly that you're right. Like any one small town may not have a diverse economy, but when you put 5 or 7 counties together, you approach this diversity. And statewide, we do in many ways reflect that same diversity. So we have to talk differently about ourselves. We are more diverse economically than ever before, and thankfully so. I do not want our economies, as they have in the past, being reliant upon a single industry that may come and go over time. So we are much more stable, but we also work in these big regions. Dartmouth does this research around mega regions. You may know this. People come and go across our communities, and this is just for commuting around our labor force. So we published this piece up right now that shows that more Minnesotans today are leaving their home county to work than don't. In fact, in 2018 is when we hit the tipping point where more than half of Minnesotans are leaving. And again, I'll remind you, these county boundaries, which we have lots of data, we're trying to incentivize action at our county level, at our sales level, at these county jurisdictions, but they don't reflect how people live. This is the dynamic between, how do we incentivize goals for our counties to achieve economic development actions? And then how do we approach this from a human perspective and see how people live? And I know Hope Williams is here. Hi, Hope. She approached us with the city of Wadena and Wadena County to talk about the extent to which we live in the middle of everywhere. She was interested in like, how do I blur the lines? We do this. Dee Dee Lemaire in our office, we have access to this mobility data around cell phone data. And we've shown that you're right. No, you just really don't have a population that never leaves town. You have people that come and go all the time. So we can look at these regions within which our residents exist. And while you may go to the west, I go to the east because I may have family over there, and we rarely see the extent to which we are overlapping with each other. And so this age of mobility that we are in requires us to look at how people are living. Where do people go to shop and eat out? We live in these huge regions. And so now we have gone through, again, these dramatic changes across this state, across this economy, nationally, around globalizations, in fact. But we really live in a regional community, and I don't say in the middle of nowhere. We're in the middle of everywhere. You put your house in the middle, and then you may work in another town or another county. You shop and eat out in these huge regions, and these dynamics of vitality rarely get reflected in our county data, right? Here's my number. Don't really see all the people coming and going. So now there was a question that we asked in our newcomer survey, and that is, do you believe the community you moved to is welcoming? Which kind of a scary question to ask, right? But we found 78% of newcomer households said the community they moved to was welcoming. But if you break it down by another question, which is, do you see yourself living here in 5 years? So for those that report the community is welcoming, 86% of, I'm going to be here in 5 years, right? But if the community within which they're living is not welcoming, now just 44%. We have a retention issue. There's a relationship here between the dynamics of your community around its welcoming atmosphere and the ability for labor to stay. Resident recruitment for us matters. It is the confluence of community development, economic development, and tourism work. And we have seen this. People are choosing across rural communities. Otter Tail County's got a whole web series out there about rural by choice, lifting up the voices of what people are doing. How are they making a living? How are they engaging with their community in these regions? So now why are our communities not changing? Why are we in the condition we're in? So I will say here is a distinctly rural trend because we have historically had a higher proportion of older people, right? When we think about the snake and we have the baby boomers, the demographic baby boomers and the snake, like they're working their way through. And we thought there was going to be a lot of housing available 15 years ago. And there's not today, and we wondered why. And this chart, I believe, explains a majority of this work. And so historically, in the past, once homeowners hit the age of early retirement, right, they start 15 to 30% start moving out of their homes. But today, this generation are not moving out of their homes. In fact, they're staying in their homes and they're inhabiting our workforce housing. So I'm going to introduce a term called churn. Like, you can't welcome in new labor into your community unless there's actually somewhere for them to live. And now we have, over the past number of years, watch a silver tsunami retire, a large number of retirements, and the 56% of older or 58% of older adults haven't changed residence in 20 years. The inability for the older adults to move over, and we're barely going to get into this today. This is a snippet. The inability for our older adults to move over inhibits the ability for new people to move in. So these folks today are staying in their homes. And what's the difference between this line? These are all the people who would have moved in over the past 15 years if there were opportunities for these older adults to move over. So now, why should you care about these older adults moving over? They're economic drivers. When I think about income, how do I characterize a local economy? I use income. I look at how much money are people earning. And when we think about income, a majority of people think it's about the jobs. But just, for example, in Crow Wing County, just 51% of all the income derived by people in the county comes in the form of a job, wage and salary. Like, part of this is dividends, interest, and rent is one piece of this mix, but the one I want to hit on here is transfer receipts. Transfer receipts are old age Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And right now, 20%, right? Sorry, this is backwards. It's dividends, interest, and rent was 20%. 29% were transfer receipts. So transfer receipts right now make up almost a third, approaching a third of all income derived in Crow Wing County. And when you think about this, this is an older population, and these folks are pass-throughs. Like old age Social Security, you're garnering those dollars and you're spending them across your community. But Medicare and Medicaid, they're pass-throughs. You think about all of these dollars right now that are being passed through individuals to your clinics, to your pharmacies, to your hospitals. We see it. We just heard the data. Education, like health services, are one of the primary employers, and we see this. So when we think about risking cuts to these core income streams to our rural communities, we are risking our current jobs. So I will say that maybe one of the best things we can do for the future of our community is just ensure there's somewhere for people to live, the housing. So I'll just end with this, that if you believe you have a labor shortage and don't connect it to the inability for people to connect with housing, then why do you have a labor shortage? People don't want to work, right? Maybe you're not paying enough. My community is not attractive enough. But if you don't acknowledge the extent to which the inability for people to locate housing in your community is totally inhibiting the ability for people to move in. 40 to 60% of home sales today you don't see on Zillow or Realtor. They're not arm's length transactions. There's things like, hey, Bridget, I know your mom's looking to sell her home. We're going to take you out for a meal and get this done. How do you approach this from a community level? Like now, you're an employer in town and you're unable to recruit labor. You better help them find a home. We see districts, school districts buy homes. They want to ensure that there's somewhere for new labor to live. So community housing becomes another whole topic, which we're not going to get into today, but it ultimately underpins many of the inability for us to achieve outcomes we would hope to have even. So part of the study I'm interested in these questions is how has the inability for these older adults to move over inhibited our economy from growing even right now? So I just want to thank you all for being here today. You all are concerned about your towns and your communities, and this is our wheelhouse. We love that you're here. So I'm going to turn this back to Brandon. I don't have a lot of questions to answer. I think there's questions around, the dynamics of mobility that play into really everything for me. So with that, just appreciate your time, everyone. Thank you for being here, Brandon.
Yeah,
Wonderful.
Ben, I was presenting this in a community recently, and they were telling a story about how they had moved communities, and as soon as people found out they had been offered a new job, they started getting emails offering to buy their house. They hadn't even thought about selling it yet, but they heard she was moving and she got offers. So it's real.
Great. And thank you both, Bridget and Ben, for taking the time to present. And we do have some questions. The questions that are more fact-based, if you want to, like real quick answers, Bridget and Ben, if you want to take a look at them, and you can either respond in the chat right now or wait till after and we can provide that information. And for those that have questions that you would like to unmute and ask, you are more than welcome to do so. We have a few minutes to answer some questions, but to start it off, I'm going to ask the question. It's come up a couple of times. And Bridget, I don't know if you can speak to, it looks like the data was through November. And with the occupation that had occurred in the Metro Surge here in January, can you speak to what the data, or have you seen anything in terms of how this might have affected Minnesota's economy?
Yeah, I think again, there's always kind of a lag, right? In terms of when the data is collected and when the data is published. So hats off to our friends at Deed who do all the work of getting that data collected and in a way that can be published. So I'm not sure we have a ton of published data yet for that time period. So that is kind of why some of the data ends with 2025 or with November. It's just kind of a matter of when things get released and are available for public consumption. I think that I know the Federal Reserve Bank has been looking at sort of what's happened because of the ICE actions in Minnesota. I think certainly there are going to be some data to look at related to that, but I have not investigated it a whole in depth at this point.
Wonderful. And I do welcome people. If you would like to ask a question directly, please feel free to unmute and you can raise your hand and I can call on you.
This
A,
is Ben. I'll
yeah,
answer one of the questions here. So calculating churn for age groups in small communities. So realtors would not have this data. So part of this is realtors are a subset of real estate agents, just so you know, and realtors are all of these expressed sales. When I mentioned that a majority or up 40 to 60% of home sales in rural communities are not like expressed arm's length transactions, I would ask you to go to your assessor, go to your local community and really talk with your assessor about any parcel transitions. Things that have changed over the past year. You can get a list of all these parcels that change. You can go to the ECRV database online at the state to get a listing of any parcels that have changed hands over the years and to see what that looks like. But it is interesting to look at how that data is out there. I will say it's even more difficult, though, the smaller community you are, to use census data because the margin of error at that point is quite large. So when you're actually trying to break it out, like by age group, housing composition by age group, I used to do it great, but the decennial census doesn't give us that accurate count anymore. So for me in our rural communities, I'm being counted like rip off your mailing list from the city and just, peel off the people by age or count the number of empty bedrooms you have in town every night. There are a lot of different ways to kind of identify the wrong people in the wrong home type problem. So, thanks.
There are some places too, Ben, counties are that will publish some of the sales data as well. I know I've looked at it for Duluth. Now it's a much bigger community. Because we were looking at that question of whether people were, yeah, how many sort of out of Duluth, like were corporations really buying up a lot of property in Duluth? I know we looked at some data there.
And there's
I
a
saw that,
question related to
yeah,
that here.
yeah.
David's got one about the challenge for rural communities, dollars buying second home. So I'll say we've already had this occupation of presence of second home purchasing. Like Aiken County, even like 15, 17 years ago, 54% of all their properties are secondary properties. And while you do have some local owners, so while that on one side, you could be like, well, that's not your wealth anymore. And it's not. If I own that property, it's my wealth where I live, and it's not measured there. But we also have done research and extension that shows 51 or 53% of second property homeowners plan to move there full time when they retire. And that actually has bumped up housing numbers in our recreational communities over the past 15 years as these people have retired and transitioned these homes from recreational property, vacant recreational property, now full-time occupied. Might not be full-time occupied. Now they may be up there all year except for the winter, and now they're snowbirds down to Florida. Again, these dynamics continue around property and parcel transitions.
And it's not always just a greater Minnesota issue too. There are parts of the Twin Cities metro where you might, have pockets of higher income housing, and then there's no place for the workforce to live. This was a long time ago, but looking at Woodbury, Woodbury had like some of the highest housing values in the state of Minnesota, and some of the like if you looked at the actual jobs, some of the lower income jobs because they're, sales and services and type things. And so it's pretty clear that people couldn't afford to work the jobs in the community and live there. And that plays out a lot of places.
Again, we could probably take one or possibly two more questions. So, Aiden, I see you unmuted.
Yes, so this is a question from the chat. Does clothing and footwear industry, does that include fast fashion and secondhand stores? Because like thinking about the increase in job vacancies, creating lower discretionary spending, which clothing and footwear fall into?
Yeah. So that was consumer spending by category. So I would think in general, as long as their, data is reported, it always kind of comes down to how do they report the data kind of piece of this. So I would think it could be included in there. Yes.
And Brigid, piggybacking off of that,
Mhm.
so in the consumer spending category, you were talking about the equation, your favorite 101. Do you have any insights into the unequal consumer spending? There's been a lot of
Yep.
conversation about the K-shaped economy and higher household incomes driving a lot of the growth through discretionary spending, and it's been flat among low-income households due to inflation. So, can you speak to anything you've seen related to Minnesota?
Yeah, I have not seen any data on that for Minnesota, so I don't have a great answer to that. Sorry, Brandon.
Yeah, no worries.
Yeah.
All right. Any other last questions before we wrap up today's event?
Hello, I'd like to know if you've presented this research to the Minnesota legislature, because it seems to me there's a knowledge gap at the legislature vis-a-vis the things they prioritize.
Yeah, so Ben and I have at various times, I know I've talked to some different legislative groups over the years. I present on a somewhat regular basis to our leadership cohort called Marl, which often has legislative people. I know Ben, you were just with Senator Tina Smith. That's national, but yes, from time to time we do get asked to present this information. We have a great partnership with the Association of Minnesota Counties and the League of Minnesota Cities. So at various times we presented at their conferences as well, but not necessarily a like regular presentation to the whole group, I guess.
Wonderful. And I think we'll leave it there. So, again, thank you, Brigid, and thank you, Ben, for taking the time to present. And thank you all for joining us for today's CD Exchange webinar. As I had mentioned before, there will be a follow-up email coming once the video is ready to be posted, along with the presenter slides, and then also resources that were mentioned and dropped in the chat that are relevant to the conversation. And if you are interested in future webinars related to a variety of topics through the CD Exchange, you can check out our website. We do have one coming up on April 21st, same time, same place. There's a link that will be going out for that soon. And that's on some of the work that Ben had mentioned on the middle of everywhere and the age of mobility. So thank you all again for taking the time to join us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thanks.